Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Lori. I hope everyone's doing well. I know there's some tumultuous times for all of us right now, but I hope everyone's doing well and is safe and healthy. As Lori said, my name is Amanda Slichter. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I serve as an assistant director of residence life at Kutztown University of Pennsylvania. And I also very proudly serve as the director of technology initiatives for MACUHO, MACUHO Proud. And my Twitter and Instagram handle is also down there. Feel free to communicate with me and keep in touch. Before we get started, there are some things I like to kind of just disclose about myself before I dive into any of these conversations. Anytime I think you're talking about identity, inclusion, social justice, I think it's appropriate to share a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from. So I openly share my identity. So I identify as a white, cisgender, bisexual woman. And I share that, again, just so you know the lens that I'm coming at this from, and also to tell you that in some ways I can relate to some of the things in here and some I cannot. So I just want to be transparent about that. Also, I want to give the disclaimer that some of you will probably come with your own lenses to this, and some of you may know a lot of this content already. So just bear with us if these are things you already know, definitions you already know. Hopefully everyone, we can meet each other at the different levels we're at and get something from this presentation. And the more that you participate along with me, the better this is for everyone. So please don't leave me hanging. All right, we're going to get started. Okay, so the title of this is a little jarring that I say, I hope you're not an ally. So let me explain a little bit what I really mean by that. So I hope you're not an ally, but I hope you act by aiming for allyship. And I think those are two very different things. I have a problem with the term ally because it sounds like a destination, a title that you can put on yourself and all of a sudden you're done. You can wipe your hands of it, you did your work and you're super proud and it's all about the language and the badge. That's not really what it's about. But I hope you act and do things that someone would look at and say, okay, that's some allyship that you're practicing. So there's three principles, as Lori said. So if you don't start with yourself, you'll fail. Oftentimes, especially I think in student affairs, residence life, our type of work, we often feel like it's very easy to pinpoint what other people are doing wrong and see other problematic things and call people out. But very often do we look inward and think, what am I doing that's problematic? What am I doing that's racist, homophobic, all of these things? What are you doing and what are you addressing within yourself? Because it's there. I promise you, it's there in all of us. Second principle, if it isn't hard, you're failing. This work is not easy. It really takes a lot of different things that we're going to look at, namely not being defensive, not taking the easy way out. You're going to confront a lot of things in yourself and other people. And if it's not hard every day, you're not doing enough. Lastly, the second you've arrived, you've failed. Things are constantly changing. There's always something new to learn. Things that were inclusive 10 years ago, no longer a thing. So even if you were some sort of superhuman robot that knew all the things about social justice and every identity out there, and you knew it all and you learned all the great things, give it like, 5 minutes, everything's going to change. So there's always something new to learn. And that second you think you've arrived as an ally and you're patting yourself on the back, you failed because you've already given up on your journey and it has to be ongoing. So those are the three things. If you take nothing else away today, remember those things and challenge yourself every day. So what are we going to learn? So what are our learning outcomes for today? As a result of this session, I hope all of you will be able to, one, name at least 2 examples of problematic allyship, the things we are not going to do moving forward. Second, describe at least one way that you can use your privilege to act in solidarity. We all have privilege and we need to think of tangible ways to use it. But as always, before we learn, we need to make some group agreements. In the hopes that we will be sharing today, I just want to set the stage with some things. Hopefully also too, something to take away from this. I think we all, when we present on these types of things or have trainings on it, there's different guidelines we all use. So maybe you use some of these on the regular, or maybe these are some that you can take back to your institution or any of your presenting toolboxes. So first, stay engaged. I think that one can be a little bit of a misnomer because that looks different for everybody. So if stay engaged is for you is you've got a lot going on, you're working from home, you're juggling, and you just have this on the background to take a few things in, you do you, take care of yourself. If stay engaged for you is we're talking about something that's a little triggering and you need to take a step back, walk away, That's staying engaged for you. If staying engaged for you is, hey, I have the time, the space, and the energy today, I'm going to participate at least once, that's staying engaged for you. Second, experience discomfort. Again, if it's not hard, you're failing. So really challenge yourself to maybe participate today or challenge something that you've done that you can think about. One of the things we talk about later on, you're going to really have to think about your privileges, maybe some mistakes you've made or some traps you've fallen into. So really lean into that discomfort because that's how you're going to learn. Next, speak your truth, no one else's. So make sure you're using I statements. Never speak for an entire group or an entire identity. For example, I wouldn't say, as a bisexual person, no, I can only speak for myself. So you never want to take on a whole group of people. And also, oops and ouch is one that I use. So if someone says something and it offends you, we don't want to let that sit. We want to address it and repair that harm. And we can only do that if you address it. So we can expect maybe you'll say something like ouch and explain why that came off a certain way to you. And if you say something and you immediately want to like put it back and you're like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, you can say oops and apologize. Number 4, accept and expect non-closure. This can be really hard. We're not going to solve all the isms today, the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, all those things. We're not going to solve it all. I hope we get a little bit closer and we all do a little bit better and we learn a little and we can share that with others. But you need to accept and expect that we're not going to get closure on all this today. Lastly, stories stay, lessons leave. So be mindful too when you're sharing today that this is recorded and it will be posted online. But to the level which you're comfortable sharing, just maybe remember that the stories with specific names and identities and all that, that should stay here. We don't want to be sharing people's personal business without their permission. But the lessons that you take away from that story need to leave, or else there is no point in sharing it. So make sure you take those lessons with you. All right, so we're going to move on. Okay, so this is where I got the idea for this session. It's all about this article I read by Ernest Owens, and they wrote the article Opinion, Why I'm Giving Up on Allies. And this was really kind of like a gut check for me, as I thought, at first at the beginning of my allyship journey, I kind of thought, oh, I'm an ally and this is what I'm doing and I'm doing the thing, right? So this is the quote that really spoke to me. So I'm going to read it. Generally, such helpers can be assumed to be assisting with a problem they didn't create. Unfortunately, this isn't the case when it comes to social issues. In society, the benefits enjoyed by the privileged come at the expense of the marginalized. Accordingly, allies are in fact trying to clean up a mess that they are at least in part implicated in. Allyship creates a false quantification of deeds rather than self-reflection on intention and approach. It means nothing to attend an advocacy rally or make a charitable donation if you still haven't come to terms with your privilege. So I read that and I just thought that's saying a lot. And I think it just speaks to a culture of people that are getting fed up with allies, fed up with people that are all show, all about, whatever's easy for them, right? If going to a rally is exciting for them, that's what they're doing. If they just want to throw some money at it, that's what they're doing. So what is this really about here, and how are we really challenging ourselves, and where are we acknowledging that we are part of the problem? Where is that? Because that's not happening enough. And at the end of the day, if you're giving yourself a title, it's making it about your ego. That's not what it's about. So, I hope you don't call yourself an ally, but at the end of the day, who cares about the semantics? We have a lot of work to do. So let's get to it. So allyship statement, as I said, I have a problem with the word ally, but allyship, if it's active, less of a problem with that word. You just need to be doing it. So full disclosure, I used to work in the Pride Center at Lehigh University, and this is what we came up with as an allyship statement. So people know when we're talking about allyship and we're using it how we feel in a proper way, this is how we define it. So allyship is an active, lifelong commitment to showing up for and advocating alongside historically marginalized communities. By leveraging power and privilege, you must practice ongoing learning, embrace challenges, and own your mistakes in order to create a just, equitable world for all. So this is a part where I'm going to ask you to participate a little bit. So we'll see how this goes. I know sometimes people are very shy in webinars, but maybe you won't leave me hanging. So I have some things bolded here as a little hint, but I want us to talk about what stands out in this statement. and why? What's important about this statement that makes it different, maybe from an old-fashioned vision of allyship? So you can either raise your hand to be unmuted, or you can pop something in the chat. I'll give you a minute to do so. Good. Okay. So a Lindsay here said it's ongoing and lifelong commitment practice. Exactly. So as we talked about in the beginning, it really has to be a commitment. Sometimes you hear from people, things get busy, or I don't have the time, or, I'm dealing with a lot right now. And I want to acknowledge and empathize, like, we're all dealing with a lot right now. The world is absolutely bonkers. And I get that. But to put it frankly and very directly, people are dying. There's a lot of injustice out there, and it's costing people's lives. There's a lot of violence. There's terrible things happening. And if you can sit by idly and watch that, and that's a problem, right? So you have to be committed to it. It has to keep going. It has to be lifelong. So I tell people, whatever you need to do to keep yourself in check with your allyship journey, if that's taking a half hour a week on your calendar, literally blocking off the time, we can do it for everything else in our lives, right? So if you have a meeting, an ongoing committee, something like that, you block the time on your calendar. Can you block the time for your anti-racism journey? Can you spend that time reading about ways to get involved in your community? Can you spend that time reading an article to learn some more things about an identity you didn't know much about before? So really committing to that. Good. Thank you, Lindsay. Anybody else before we move on? Anything else that stands out here? That's a good place to start. The other things I wanted to point out here, we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but advocating alongside is super important. I think, again, something we tend to do a lot as student affairs professionals or residence life folks, we want to do and we want to fix and we want to be super involved. Sometimes you need to know when to take a back seat, advocate alongside. If someone is leading a movement, is an organizer, has that identity, has the experience, don't come into that rally or march and try to take the lead or organize. This is not your RA program, okay? Sit back and listen to the people that have the identity, that are organizing and leading, and support. Ask how you can be supportive, follow directions. That's how you're going to be a good ally in that way. Okay, we're going to move on. So some things to process first. Again, many of you may be super familiar with these terms already, but I don't want to make that assumption. So first word we need to talk about, phrase actually, historically marginalized identity. So that is an identity that has not been centered or privileged in mainstream cultural, social, political, or economic systems. Next, intersectionality. And I think we really need to talk about this word because quite honestly, it's been whitewashed. So intersectionality is the complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, classism, combine, overlap, or intersect. Now, what it's been kind of whitewashed down to mean was something like, have you ever heard someone say, we need to take a more intersectional approach, or intersectional identities? If people have taken it to mean something like as simple as, we all have different identities, we all have multiple identities. That's cute and all, but that's obvious. Like, duh, we all have different identities. Like I said at the beginning, I have a lot of identities and I named them. We know that. That's not what this is about. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term, and what she meant was that all of these identities and the ways that this discrimination existed, it was cumulative, and that compounded oppression is what we're talking about here. So if you're talking about intersectionality and you're not thinking about oppression and the way that that overlaps, you're not thinking of intersectionality, you're just thinking of multiple identities. So I think that's important anytime we talk about allyship, to keep in mind those situations, and that people have lots of different experiences, and they're going to be unique depending on those compounding oppressions. Privilege. So this is a word people get really sensitive about. Who would have thought, right? So one of the things we need to talk about with privilege is that we all have it in some way. This is not an insult. This is not a dig. This is not something to be ashamed about. It's a set of automatic benefits given to people who fit into a specific social or identity group. It doesn't mean that you don't have hardships. It just means that your identities aren't causing those hardships. It's not contributing to those hardships. Privilege is about just having a little bit of a head start. That's what it really is. And people have such a hard time with that and get so defensive when really it's a gift. If you have privilege, you have power, which is something we're going to talk about power. So, with that privilege, you have power, which is the access to resources and the ability to influence. So, people may take you more seriously, may have more automatic respect for you based on your identities. Resources could be anything from a space to media to money. To positions of power. There are all sorts of things could be implied here. But what's important, if anyone knows the quote from Spider-Man, Uncle Ben, with great power comes great responsibility. It's a gift. And I always say privilege isn't something to be ashamed about. But maybe there is a level of rightful shame if we're not doing anything with the power that's granted to us from that privilege. You have a responsibility, and I think an ethical responsibility as a decent human being to use that power and try to set the playing field a little more evenly because we know our world is not made up that way right now, right? So it's all about using that power to try to really reach out and help and work alongside marginalized identities to do your best on your allyship journey. So, dang, Amanda, what the heck am I supposed to do about all of this nonsense? So, I just painted a jury picture, right? There's a lot going on, there's a lot of inequity, and there's a lot of do's and don'ts and problematic things. But we're going to sort some of that out. So on the left side here, we have the yes, please column. Please do that. That's good. On the right side, we have sheesh. That's a yikes. Don't do that. Super bad. Things we see, what I call our allyship traps. So we're going to talk about these. And some of them kind of mirror each other in that, for example, let's see here. A good example of that would be so living in your comfort zone is totally a foil to take the risk. So we're going to talk about these. The first one, listening and self-work. The amount that we could learn if we sometimes just take a step back to shut up and listen is incredible. So you need to listen. And my biggest thing is if someone tells you something is wrong or offensive and they are a member of that identity group, they are right, period. Okay, so if someone tells you, hey, that was kind of racist, you're not going to come back and explain why it's not. You're going to listen, you're going to think, you're going to reflect, you're going to apologize, and you're going to do better. So just make that assumption and be prepared and humble in accepting that. Another yes, please, is get your people. Something that we really struggle with, I think, I will speak to myself actually. So I struggle with as a white person, this can be really hard because I think also as a woman, I've been socialized to be polite, to not cause conflict, to not stir the pot, that kind of thing. We want things to be nice and conflict free. But if we're doing that, it can be really hard to get your people. If you see someone doing something that's racist, something that's not right, something that's offensive, and they share an identity with you, go and get them. It's not enough to simply be not causing harm directly yourself. You're causing harm if you're complicit in the harm that you see and allow other people to perpetuate. Next, pass the microphone. So if you are in a position of power, you need to share that power and pass it to people maybe who don't look like you. Share that space. So for example, I said I'm on the executive board in MACUHO. So something we want to make sure we're doing is looking around and seeing who's in the room, who's not in the room, who's talking, who's not talking, and making sure that all the voices are being heard. And if there are times I need to step back and pass the proverbial or literal microphone to someone else who's not being represented, then that needs to be done. Next, know when something doesn't belong to you. Oh, I love this one. So basically what I'm saying here is two things. Physical spaces I'm talking about, and I'm talking about culture and things, like more tangible things. So we often like to take things that are not ours. So whether that's appropriating something that's from another culture or another identity, we do this all the time, right? You think of hairstyles that we've taken, nails, all sorts of things like fashion, music. We like to take things on that don't belong to us, but then at the same time not respect the culture that it's coming from. So that's problematic. But I think something we don't think about here also is physical spaces. So sometimes you've probably heard of things like affinity groups or safe spaces, or, for example, like a coming out support space. Those types of spaces are created so that people who share an identity, for example, in MACUHO, we have affinity groups for professionals of color or for queer professionals. And there are certain spaces that we have that are for those people to come together and talk about shared experiences. And if you don't have that identity, that space doesn't belong to you. Get. And you genuinely have some people who are like, well, why can't I come? Isn't that discriminatory, or isn't that keeping me out? Or how am I supposed to learn if I'm not allowed into these spaces? Every other space exists for you. Like, get out, accept that that's not your space to learn, and seek out other learning opportunities, because there's plenty. And you can start with Google. This space where you can be safe and share your identities, if you're part of that marginalized identity, are one of the few spaces maybe that exist where you don't have to worry about the stereotypes or the oppression that come day to day in your life from the dominant group. Lastly, take the risk. This is so hard for so many of us. We don't want to speak up. And I think it can be hard too in the workplace. Again, because we've been socialized about professionalism. We're worried about our career. But I'm constantly thinking about what I need to do if I take my allyship journey seriously, what I need to do to put my head on the pillow at night to feel good about what I said that day. Did I let something slide, or did I speak up? And sometimes that might be to my supervisor. That might be to a leader in the department. That might be to my own parents. Who knows what that is? But you have to take that risk. And staying silent is just another form of violence. And you're complicit in that oppression, then, which is just as bad. And that can be really, really hard. But there's something that really stuck with me. So I've heard Dr. Victoria Ferris speak about this before, and she shares the example of saying, a lot of times I've thought about speaking up, and I thought about my colleagues of color, for example. So Dr. Ferris is a white person, and she speaks about her colleagues of color and thinking about how anytime that she has spoken up in the past, she's never been disciplined or spoken down to, where she could not say the same for colleagues of color. In fact, she's been maybe promoted or on to the next step in her career. So if you have that privilege, use it, speak up. So on the other side here, we have sheesh, that's a yikes. And these are things you should not do and are super problematic. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves and reflecting here, we're going to realize that we've done many, if not all, of these things at some point. And maybe you're still doing this. And just so you can prepare to participate, I'm going to be asking us to share examples of how we've done these things in a little bit. So the first one, performative allyship. We all know this person. This person is on social media. They're sharing all the things. They're taking all the pictures. They're taking the selfie at the rally. They're making sure they're using the hashtag. That's that person. But they're not doing the other things. They're not doing the self-work. They're not listening, right? It's just on that end that's very visible. And when it's hard or when it's behind the scenes, maybe they're not participating. That's not to say that some of the things they're doing, maybe that presence on social media is educating some people, and that can be helpful. I think it's important that you're not solely in this box as a ally, because that's where the problem is. Next, savior complex. Yeah, that's a one we see a lot. So you think that you can come in and save a group or be the hero because you're part of the marginalized group, and again, you're taking away that autonomy from a group. You're stealing the microphone instead of passing it. That's super problematic. A good example of this, and this is not meant to be giving any shame or shaming anyone who's done this, because there are benefits to these things. But I would ask us to think critically about, for example, mission trips. Mission trips have been criticized as being an example of savior complex, right? Because you go in and you raise all this money to go on this trip to a country or a region with less resources, and you go there and you're helping, and you take this trip and you get on the plane and you have all this stuff that you do there, and you take the pictures, you build the school, whatever you're doing there, and then you get up and leave. And the community is left again kind of where they started. There's no resources left to like help maintain it, not teaching people how to maintain that or work in their own autonomy for that community. So instead of pointing the community, you visit the community and you leave. And that can be a problematic example of savior complex. The third one, living in your comfort zone. Imagine what a difference we could all make if we really spoke up and did the things that make us uncomfortable. If we had that tough conversation, if we spoke with that family member, if we never let it slide. Because I know, myself included, we've had those moments where we didn't do the right thing. Next one, defensiveness. Again, if someone tells you something is offensive, believe them. Think about it. Even if you're so sure you didn't mean it that way, we know that impact matters way more than intention. So trust that when someone is telling you something, that there's value in that and that you need to see it from their perspective. So instead of getting defensive, assume that you are being educated here and it is a gift to you and you should receive it openly. Next is tone policing. I think this is a really popular one in the workplace because, again, it's under that guise of professionalism. So if someone is maybe rightfully upset about racism that they're seeing or some sort of discrimination of any kind, and they're upset about that, we often attack the person and their tone or their volume, something like that, and we make it about that instead of really listening to what they're upset about. And that erases the issue and what's important here. Lastly, erasing or not seeing difference. I think a lot of us are maybe doing better at moving past this. I think we start to understand why the phrase, I'm colorblind or I don't see color, why that's problematic, right? We don't want to erase identities or pretend they're not there. We know that they're there. Pretending they're not there is not helping. So we need to do better and not pretend that we cannot see difference, right? Differences exist and they need to be celebrated and lifted up, not ignored or pretended that they don't exist. Because if you pretend something's not there, you're going to keep doing number 3. You're going to keep living in your comfort zone and nothing's going to change. So are there any questions about these before I move on to the next slide? All right, let's see here. Okay, so Cindy said, I find it hardest for me to have conversations with my family members. Agreed, absolutely, me too. I will push to share different perspectives a little, but not too much. Cindy, thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. I think you have a point. I think sharing different perspectives is a good start. And I think that's maybe something that you need to work up to. And I think even just being self-aware now to reflect on, maybe I haven't pushed enough. That's something that's a first step, right? Not being defensive and thinking that for yourself is a good step. And we all just need to kind of navigate that. And I tell people too, when you are confronting people about something, be strategic. So sometimes people can be really rude or jarring or something because they're coming from a place of anger. And I get it. I'm angry. It's bad out there. And there's a lot of things for us to be angry about. But sometimes you have to really be strategic and kind of like getting someone on your side. I tell people, if you're getting upset and being rude and calling people out simply to make yourself look good or to vent your emotions, then that's not a good strategy. Sometimes I'll even do a little kind of like ego petting a little bit to kind of bring people in. So I'll start with something like, hey, I know you're a really good person and I know you want the best and I know you're not X, Y, and Z. When really, I don't know that. Maybe they're not a good person, but I want them to trust me and I want them to think that I'm on their side when really there's a lot of problems here. So whatever you need to do to kind of push a little bit more each time, maybe it's progressive and maybe that's a good strategy. But I think you raise a good point here about maybe more does need to happen. It's just a matter of how that you navigate that. Anyone else for questions about these things before we move on? So this is where I'm hoping that we can participate. Again, whatever's easier for you. If you don't want to type in the chat, if you just want to raise your hand, we can unmute you. But I'm hoping we can talk and have a real conversation about speaking our truth. So which one, and I can go back to the slide, which one of these allyship traps do you sometimes fall into? And remember, give each other grace. We're here to learn. I always tell people in trainings, like, this is the place to screw up, right? Like, say the wrong thing here, do the wrong thing here. We need to give each other grace and use this as the space to learn, right? Not in real life when we're interacting with students, colleagues, other human beings in that genuine, way. This is where we want to learn. So, does anyone have anything to share about? I'll go back to the slide. So, what are some traps maybe that we fall into? As you think of your ideas and put them in the chat, raise your hands, please, please, please. I'll share my own. So the biggest one that I think I can fall into is living in my comfort zone. So I can think of times where, so for family members, for example, I can think of times where I have said something, and I can think of times where I haven't because I was just so tired that day and I made a million excuses. So I need to really check myself and be braver in those moments. Anybody else for maybe another one like performative, tone policing, being defensive? Has anyone ever experienced those things in their allyship journey? I'm betting we have, and we're just a little shy today, and that's okay. And we might also not be in a space where we're able to kind of unmute, and I empathize with that right now. I think we do have one comment. So a Lindsay said, definitely agree with living in my comfort zone. It's always easier to not say anything. I get it. Especially, as I said, these are tough times right now, and a lot of us are under a lot of stress. And I try to remind myself that I'm in this space where, in a lot of privileged identities that I have the choice whether to walk away in that moment, that one time that week or one time that month that I see the racism, that I see the cissexism, that I see the whatever, right? When I see that, I have the option of walking away or saying something or not. Whereas my colleagues, students, friends of color, whereas my transgender colleagues, students, friends, all of that, they do not have a choice. And they're facing this daily, time after time after time. So isn't it the thing that I need to do that when I see those things much less often, much less on a regular basis, don't I have a responsibility to do the right thing, step up every single time? So I get it. I know that and I remind myself of that and I still screw it up. So definitely empathy with that. And thank you for being vulnerable and saying that. Okay. So moving on. This is the last thing. So we don't have to share these out loud with each other. I totally empathize that we may not want to do that right now. However, I do want you, wherever you are right now, if you're on your laptop, if you have a piece of paper or your phone nearby, I want you all to take a moment and write this down and fill in the blanks for yourself. And then I want you to put this somewhere visible, whether this is somewhere in your office, hang it up, or maybe put it on the inside of your planner or calendar or something like that if you want it more private. You can make it the lock screen on your phone. I want this to be a visual reminder for all of us. So complete this statement, write it down somewhere, anywhere, type it on your laptop. The sentence is, I used to think blank, but then I learned blank. Now I commit to doing blank by leveraging the power from my blank privilege. So take a moment, think about that, right? And it may be easier. So some folks in the past have struggled with this a little bit and they found it easier to start from the bottom, from the last blank. So think about your privileged identities first and maybe think about what you can do with that and something you learned. So take the time, write this down. And if you have time later today to maybe fill this out or complete it, just make this a priority. Because I think without visual reminders, we can do, as Cindy said, as Lindsay said, we can sometimes take the easy way out. So I think a visual reminder really speaks into existence a lot of the things that we need to do better. So I have one of these for myself, and I hope you'll use it too. And that's what I have to leave you with today. So are there any questions or anything anyone wants to talk about, things that I brought up, anything we need to discuss or unpack a little bit?
I can give folks a couple minutes to maybe think of some things. And while we're doing that, just a quick reminder that we are recording this, as I had mentioned earlier, and we'll definitely be putting the link out on YouTube for others to view. But I would like to say this has been really helpful and gave me lots of things to think about, and taking the risk and things like that is that's a hard thing sometimes, but I really like the statement at the end too, so I'll definitely be utilizing that too. So I really like that, found that a very useful takeaway.
Thanks, Lori.
I'm not seeing anything as far as additional questions or comments. So Amanda, if you are comfortable, we can go ahead. Oh, there's one more. Sorry, I was too fast.
No worries. I know sometimes it takes a while to get our thoughts out. Okay. Oh, this is a good one. Okay. So this question here, can you unpack impact versus intent a little more? Mostly in terms of folks who don't seem to understand their impact on others. Is there a good exercise out there that might help for group work? So that's a good question. So first I'll do the unpacking of impact versus intent. So this is kind of confusing for some people. So when we say impact versus intent, what we're trying to say here is that we want to trust that intent is good. However, at the end of the day, what's most important is the impact that you have. So if something you're doing or saying is having a negative impact, instead of apologizing and saying, I didn't mean that, or that's not what I meant, or oh, I never wanted to make you feel uncomfortable, don't waste your time with those statements. If someone says, hey, that was offensive or that was sexist, you should instead respond saying, I apologize, I will do better. And even so, I would say the extra step, instead of asking, sometimes people will be like, well, why? Or what was offensive about it? And I know that they mean in that situation to learn. However, a lot of the times people with marginalized identities are so often asked to be the teachers, and it's exhausting. That's a lot of emotional labor. So if someone says something's offensive, you're going to apologize and move on, and then maybe go to the Google machine and ask it what was wrong with that, right? There's a lot of resources out there for us to learn, and you can Google almost anything these days, right? So like do the homework and figure out what was wrong with what you did, and don't put that labor on someone else. So I think with impact versus intent, you really need to think about if something is having a negative impact, you're responsible for that, regardless of whether your intent was to cause harm or not. And then a good exercise out there that might help for group work. I have one thought, but does anyone else in the group have anything that's been helpful for them? So one thing that I've done is there's an activity called identity signs. And it's kind of like you have different identities kind of taped on the wall in a room. Maybe this is not in COVID times, but you have identities like sexuality, you have race, you have gender expression, gender identity, and you have all these things around the room on the wall. And you have statements that you read saying something like, what is an identity that is often misunderstood by others? And you have this list of statements that you read, and people in the room are supposed to go to the category of identities that resonates with them. So, for example, I might go to the sexuality sign and say that, hey, my bisexual identity is misunderstood often by others. And then the facilitator can call on people and ask, why are you standing where you're standing? And with intent versus impact, there are some statements you could work in about saying something like, what is a time that someone said something to you or stereotyped you in a negative way that hurt, or said something that hurt? And sometimes some impact versus intent can be impacted there, and people can realize that some of the things that they are saying or doing have been harmful with that activity. And you could even tailor some of the questions to specifically focused on that impact versus intent. So hopefully if you're having that issue with a group of people or in the workplace or something, maybe an activity like that would help. Any other questions? Yeah, you're welcome. Any other things we want to talk about? I'll also just pop my email address in the chat quick. So if there's something you don't want to share because it's recorded or anything like that, and you want to, chat offline or Zoom anytime, I'm available. So that's my work email. Feel free to reach out. We can always talk some more.